Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. If you didn't know, summer's here. And with the start of summer, we're starting a brand new series called Lost Privileges. So if you're a guest or you're kind of new to Mountain Ridge, you picked a great week to be here or to be online with us because we're starting something that we're going to take the next several weeks, actually a lot of the summer, to walk through the book of Daniel. And we're doing it in such a way that I hope, at least for you, is encouraging and also at the same time kind of gives some perspective to the world around you and what's happening. Because it seems like things have been changing really, really fast. And not just changing, but changing in such a way that it's kind of uncomfortable and kind of unsettling. And when that happens, one of the things that we all do, a believer, follower of Jesus, not a follower of Jesus, one of the things that happens when things start changing fast is we look for something that we can control. And so let me give you an example from my own life. Recently, I had to go to the doctor. I'd turned 50 and, you gotta, it's been a while, but I took a while to get to the doctor too. And, you go in and they're kind of telling you all the stuff and encouraging you and trying to help you, take care of your health. And the lady told me, she goes, now that you're this age, which is a terrible way to start a sentence, right? Now that you're this age, you need to be thinking about some things a little bit differently. You probably need to make sure you're getting more rest. And you definitely need to be more disciplined in your diet. And you got to get more committed to being regular, to exercising and all of these things and kind of listed some other stuff. And she said, embrace the fact that there's some changes to make. And as I walked out of the office, I thought, I am going to embrace the change. I'm getting a different doctor that will tell me what I want to hear instead of what I need to hear. And that's what we do, isn't it? When things are changing and fast and out of control, we try to grab something that we can hold on to, something that we can control that makes us feel better. Because there have been a lot of changes. And some of them are good and some are bad, but there's been a lot of changes in the world around us. And let's be honest, when the world around you changes, sometimes you care, sometimes you don't care, right? I mean, you look and you want good things for people and all that other stuff, but it's when your world changes that it starts to get serious, right? There's the economy and then there's my economy, right? And if the economy changes, but my economy doesn't, it's like, well, I hope it works out for everybody. When my economy changes, then it's like, something's got to be done here. We got to have some changes here because I don't have money or maybe it's your job, or maybe it's your family situation, your relationships. It's just when everything out there is changing, it's one thing. When everything in here is changing, that's another thing, right? It kind of gets disorienting. And we start to wonder, what exactly is happening? Where are things going? Because I kind of had this picture of my life. I kind of had this structure for the way things would be and the values and morals that I would have and the way my life would go and the money and the job and the family and all this stuff. And people are messing with it, right? And that starts to unnerve us a little bit. And when we get disoriented, unfortunately, for a lot of people, maybe not you, but for a lot of people, and I think you can see this playing out, when we get disoriented, it shows up as sadness and depression. It shows up as fear and frustration. And a lot of times it gets expressed as anger. I'm just mad. I don't even know why I'm mad. I'm mad because stuff changed. I'm mad because stuff isn't the way I want it to be. I'm mad because other people are getting away with, or because other people are saying, or other people are doing. And I'm mad because my job and my money and my stuff. And it's so easy to see that disorientation get expressed in a negative way. And I hope that's not you, but I would have to be honest with you. I've felt that way. I've probably expressed some of my frustrations that way at times. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you have experienced that too, because it is fairly normal. And for a lot of us, we look at where things are going. We look at the way things used to be, the way things are now, and the way things might be in the future, and we're concerned. We're concerned. And before you think I'm the conspiracy theorist and all that other stuff, this isn't the angry guy that's like, you kids get off my lawn. I'm not that guy. I'm not saying, these kids today. It's not that at all. It's just a very basic question. Where are we going? Where are we going? And maybe even more important, if you're a parent or a grandparent or you're wanting to be parents or you've got nieces or nephews or kids in your family, you kind of wonder, not only where are we going, where are we leading the ones that are coming behind us? Because it doesn't feel like we're going in a good direction. And now I got to say, I want to say this. I do want to say this up front. The tornado of issues that has hit us has sped everything up. And so if you're somebody, when you're the age that you are, like me, when you hit that age, you can kind of look back and you get a little perspective. Or maybe some of you are just really smart and you see this too anyway, even though you're not old like me. But you see this, that the things that used to take decades to change have changed in years. And the things that used to take years to change have changed in months. And it's not only disorienting, it is concerning because you begin to wonder, is anybody steering the ship? Where is this going to go? And not only is it discouraging and disorienting and all those other things, but I want to be fair. Some of the changes that I see happening are really good. There are things that Jesus pointed at. Caring about the poor and marginalized is a fantastic change that has kind of come across the radar. Racial equality and putting an end to racism, a wonderful change. Elevating and valuing the role of women and seeing that women and men are equal and one's not better than the other, wonderful thing. Jesus did and pointed at and expressed all of these things in his ministry. But for every one change we see that's moving in the right direction, and I'm being honest, I'm probably biased, okay? It feels like there's 3 or 4 changes that are moving in the wrong direction, that are moving away from what Jesus said and away from the values that Jesus preached, and most importantly, for the life that Jesus died to give us. It feels like often we're kind of moving away from that. And the culture has changed. And again, here's where, it depends on your world and your experience and everything else. So I apologize. If this isn't the way you see it, I understand. I'd love to talk with you about it. But this is how I see it. And so I just want to share for just a minute. When I think about culture, it feels like to me that culture has kind of looked at faith as a bad toddler, right? A misbehaving toddler. And it's kind of like, okay, it's time for you to go into timeout. You need to go over here into the corner and just be quiet. You've lost your privileges. You're kind of being set aside right now. Faith is kind of been removed from the public square. Faith isn't really important until it's time to get some votes. And faith, we want the things that faith provide. We want people to get along and be nice and love each other. We don't want the king of the kingdom, though. We just want you to kind of stay quiet over off to the side. And as a result, whatever privileges faith had in our society, at least in the time that I've been here, it seems like it's lost a lot of those privileges. Sometimes because of the things we've done, sometimes because the culture has actually turned a little bit hostile to some of the ideas and values of faith, specifically Christian faith and following Jesus. And so for some, it's easy to feel defeated. It's easy to not just be concerned, but to actually feel like something is being lost and something is being taken away from me. And when that happens, change, like we said, sadness, depression, frustration, anger show up. But I've got good news for you. And that's what we're going to spend the next several weeks looking at. There is some really good news. Faith losing privileges is not a deal breaker. As a matter of fact, faith thrives even without privileges. And here's what it really comes down to. When you start to think about faith and privileges, it's about making progress without privileges. You don't have to have privileges in a culture or society for faith to make dramatic gains and a massive kind of impact. And that's what we're going to look at. And so it's not only good news, it's actually great news. The world we're living in, it may be very different than what you expect. It may not be what it was when you were younger or when you were living a different life or what you were hoping for. But that doesn't mean there's no room for faith in it. And the stories we're going to use to kind of help us understand this came 2,600 years ago. And so if you've got a Bible or you want to follow along in the app, it's in the book of Daniel. And it's Daniel chapter 1. And we meet this fascinating person. And while he is fascinating, what's even more fascinating to me is what God does around him and in him and through him, where he lives in this culture that gave no consideration to faith. But yet, faith actually thrived, and faith actually overcame so many things that seemed unovercomable. I don't even know if that's a word, but it was just so impressive how faith showed itself when it had no reason to be successful. If you know the story of Daniel, I want to give you just a quick little bit of background before we get into Daniel 1. Daniel was a Jewish Hebrew teenager. He lived in Jerusalem. Chances are he was doing okay. He was probably either wealthy or well-educated or maybe connected somehow to the royal family or something like this. He lived a privileged lifestyle among his peers. But the Bible tells us that God, this is important, God brought the Babylonian Empire to Judah to punish them. That God brought this outside nation, this foreign nation, not God's people. As a matter of fact, the people that seem to oppose God's people, God brought them, it says, to Judah to attack and conquer them. If you know just a little bit of Bible history, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but it's important for you to know. Originally, the nation of Israel were 12 tribes. They were God's chosen people. At least that's the way they saw themselves, and that's what they feel like God had communicated to them, that he chose them, he promised them a land, he delivered them out of slavery, he gave them this land. Well, eventually, they began to need a king, want a king, so they got a king, and eventually, exactly what God said would happen, happened. The king started taxing people, and they started having internal problems, and before long, there was a civil war. The tribes in the north and the tribes in the south began to fight each other. And then one nation broke into two. The northern nation was called Israel. The southern nation was called Judah. And the nation of Israel, the ones that broke off and broke away, were actually conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Walked through, just destroyed everything, took everyone, and they were still coming. But God protected the nation of Judah. And so here's why I tell you all this. The people living in Judah believed something. They believed that they were special. That even though our brothers that broke off from us, even though those that fought us and broke away and said, we don't want to be part of you anymore, God punished them. God allowed them to be taken, but God spared us. We are God's chosen people. The nation of Judah had within it the capital of Jerusalem, which had within it the temple of God. And they felt like they were very secure because no matter what happens, God will protect us. The book of Daniel says that God brought the Babylonians to Judah. And city by city and region by region, their war machine rolled through that country, killing people and taking stuff until they got to the capital of Jerusalem. But I'm sure every good Jewish person that lived there believed somehow, some way, God is going to break out and break through and preserve us. Even though we haven't really been following him, even though we haven't really been paying attention to him, somehow he'll save us because we're special. We're unique. There's no place like us. But he didn't. He brought Babylon to Judah, and they overtook the capital of Jerusalem. They ransacked the city. They took the best of everything, the art, the culture, the money, the food. They took everything. They got into the temple, and they took all the things that were special and holy to the Jewish people. And they hauled them off, just dragged them away. And not only did they take the best of everything, they took the best of the best people. If you were smart, if you were young, if you were good looking, if you seemed healthy, then you can come and be a servant and a slave for us. And Daniel was one of those guys. Daniel was a man. He wasn't really a man. He was probably a teenage boy. And his three friends got caught up in this. They were taken back to Babylon against their will as slaves. And where they were forced, this wasn't an option. This wasn't like, hey, if you want to take some classes or if you want to improve yourself a little bit. It was kind of like, if you'd like to live, here's what you're going to do. You're going to learn the Babylonian language because we don't speak Hebrew here. You are going to learn about Babylonian culture. You're going to learn our values, why we do what we do. Oh, and your Hebrew names, we're not going to use those because those have to do with a God that we don't believe in. We're changing your names. So you don't get to speak your language. You don't get to keep your values. You don't get to keep your name. Oh, and by the way, you need to learn our religion too. And I don't mean you just need to learn it. You need to understand it. You need to believe it as much as we can force you to believe it at the point of a sword. Because if you don't, we can kill you and go on to somebody else. This was the environment that Daniel was dragged into. And it was a 3-year program. And for the Babylonians, it just made sense, right? We're going to bring in all these guys. We're going to bring in all these people. They're going to serve us. It's just easier if they speak our language. They understand our ways. They follow our traditions. I mean, it's just, there's a part of it that it's just simply easier this way. But there was also kind of a deeper reason. We're just going to brainwash them. We're just going to get them to give up on their past, these young, impressionable teenagers. Give up your past, live like us, and everything will be easy. And that's exactly what they did for the most part. Daniel and his friends were brought up into this, and they lost all of their privileges. There was nothing they had that was their own. They had no options. They had no alternatives, and they went along with it. The only privilege that they got was they were allowed to eat from the king's table, which actually is a pretty cool thing because it means the king eats the good food, right? Okay, he's not eating the scraps. And it meant that they were going to be fed from the same food stores and the same foodstuffs that the king was fed from. So they were going to get the best food. If they had any privileges at all, it was that. Except for Daniel and his 3 friends, it turned out that the king's table was the turning point. Look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 with me, because this is where, even after losing all these privileges, something finally broke. Verse 8 says this: Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission. The chief official was the guy that was in charge of all of these guys. He asked him for permission not to defile himself this way. And God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than any other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Now, just stop there, because there's a couple comments I want to make. First of all, you might think, why? All the stuff you didn't object to, learn their religion, have your name changed, give up all this stuff, accept their values, learn their language. Why did you object to the food? Why was that the breaking point? This is something you need to understand about their culture. You see, for Daniel, who was Jewish, and also for the Babylonians, most of the meat they ate was sacrificed to idols. And it makes sense, and I don't want to gore you out or anything, but for a long time, nations, cultures, religions have used animal sacrifice as part of their worship, whether they were worshiping the real God or they were worshiping an idol. This has always been part of it. And here's where it gets a little gross, if it makes sense. The big part of the sacrifice was the blood. Okay, that was the big thing. And they did burn some of the animals as kind of a barbecue for God, right? Or a barbecue for their idol. That was how they did it. But if you've ever been around a farm, you know this. There's a lot of animal left, right? And there's no refrigerator, there's no freezer, there's no place to put it. And so when somebody worshiped through sacrifice, everybody else thought, we're having a barbecue, right? Okay, that's good. We're going to eat good. Well, for the king, sacrifices were made every day. And they ate that meat every day. And for Daniel, and for the Babylonians, they knew this too. Eating that meat was a part of worshiping that God. This is why it was a line in the sand. You want to call me by another name? Go ahead. You want to make me learn another language? Okay. You want to force me to do something I don't want to do and work in a job I don't want to have? All right. But I can't dishonor God. I can't do that. I can give up all my privileges, all of my rights, all of that stuff, but I cannot dishonor God. And this was not about Daniel's preference. This wasn't that Daniel liked it one way versus another. This wasn't his privilege that he's stamping his foot and saying, don't you know who I am? It is none of that stuff. It is, I cannot forsake the God who has walked with me and saved me and whom I'm basing my life and my future on. I can't do it. I can't eat this food. And so he asked the guy, hey, can we try something else? And the guy said, it says he liked him. It says God gave Daniel favor. And here's Brett's theory. This is Brett's theory. I think Daniel was likable. I think in the middle of all of that stuff, where it would be so easy to be bitter and angry and ticked off and just pushing away and not wanting to and everything else, I think Daniel was still likable. Because here's, again, Brett's theory. So don't read this in the Bible. This is Brett's theory. God doesn't usually show favor to critical, complaining, grumpy people. He doesn't, right? I mean, how many people would you say, oh, God showed him a lot of favor because they were so angry and mad at everybody? God showed him a lot of favor because they complained better than anybody else. It doesn't work that way. God showed him favor and he was likable. And here's something I love this. This was about 10 or 12 years ago. Tim Sanders wrote a book called Likeability. And it's a really fascinating book because in this book, Likeability, he does something that we already all know. He says that likable people get better things. Like when you go in and you're likable, you get more attention from the doctor. When you go in and you're likable, the sales clerk is more patient with you and more willing to help you. When you're making a sale, if you're likable, the person's more likely to buy something from you. We all know this. This isn't anything new. But here's what he did. He defined likability. He figured out what is it that actually makes somebody likable. And he reduced it to 5 things, super simple things. The first one was, he said, likable people smile. They smile more and often. They smile. They help other people. They're humble. It's not about me. It's not me getting what I want. It's not about me. I'm humble. I'm thinking about other people first. They're encouraging. They're pointing out the good things that other people are doing. They point out the good things they see in somebody else. And they're generous. They're generous with their time. They're generous with their emotions. They're generous with their finances. That likable people have these 5 qualities. And here's what struck me when I was reading this book and I was reading about Daniel and everything else. I realized, you know who the most likable person to ever exist was? Jesus. Now, I can't prove to you that he smiled. I mean, I don't see Jesus walking around with a grumpy face on all the time, but I can't prove that part. But I can show you story after story after story after story of him being helpful, humble, encouraging, and generous. That's the essence of who he was. And that tells me that if I'm a follower of Jesus, I should be one of the most likable people on the planet. If I'm going to be like him, I should be likable. And Daniel took this and he said, how do you live in a hostile culture? When they've taken away all your privileges, when they've taken away all your preferences, when they've forced you to do things you don't want to do, you respond by being likable. And God favors that. So here's Daniel, stuck with this line in the sand that I just can't go over. And he asked the one person, or at least one of the persons that could help him, and he gets the answer, no, I'm afraid. I'm afraid what will happen. So look what happens next. Verse 11. Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over him, had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those were the three guys with him. He says this, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, which, by the way, sounds horrible, okay? I mean, green M&Ms are as close as I get to vegetables, but give them vegetables to eat and water to drink. I'm like, man, that's the hard part right there. That's giving up everything. Verse 13, then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink, and they gave them vegetables instead. I love it. I love it. Daniel didn't give up. He just went to the next guy, right? He started with this guy, and this guy said no. He goes, okay. So he goes over here to the next guy, and he says, hey, what do you think? How could we do this? He was determined but not defiant. He was absolutely determined. I am not going to dishonor God. But he wasn't defiant. He didn't ask to speak to the manager, right? He didn't throw a fit. He wasn't that person that nobody wants to be around, that everybody's like, walk over here because they're losing it over there. I mean, he wasn't that angry guy. He wasn't that frustrated guy. He wasn't that egotistical guy. He was determined, but not defiant. How do you live in a hostile culture? When you've lost your privileges, when people think your ways are out of touch, when they think your morality is a joke, when they would rather you be quiet than say something. Well, you're likable, but most importantly, you're determined, but you're not defiant. You don't make it about you. And here's what I know, and here's what we're about to see. When you decide and determine in your heart, I will not dishonor God. I'll give up whatever I have to give up. I'll deal with whatever I have to deal with, but I will not dishonor God. Here's what I know God does. God always provides a way through for you. Every single time. Whether it's at your work, in your family, at your job, and your money, with all your stuff, whatever it might be. When you make the decision that I will not dishonor God, it's not about me, it's about him, and I am not going to dishonor him. He will always make a way through. No matter how hostile, no matter how strange, no matter how difficult the situation or the environment may seem at the moment, he will always make a way for you. Daniel continued this journey. Verse 17 says this, kind of a little bit of a summary. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. So in essence, they went through the whole 3-year program, okay? They did everything they were supposed to do. They ate vegetables and water for 3 years. They did the whole thing, and they're kind of rounding it up here. In verse 19, the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is just phenomenal. God, and don't miss this. It said God gave them wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. You remember what they were studying? They were studying the Babylonian language. They were studying the Babylonian culture. They were studying their art and philosophy. They were understanding the Babylonian religion. All the things that dishonored God, all the things that they believed that were wrong, all the practices that they had, God gave them knowledge, insight, and understanding into those things. That's a big takeaway for us. And I get it as a dad. Sometimes we are so petrified about what our children are going to be exposed to. And don't get me wrong, I don't think we should intentionally expose them to awful things. But sometimes we are so paralyzed and so afraid and so angry about what's happening that we miss something really, really important. The gospel shines so brightly that no matter what you're doing in culture, and I hope you don't misunderstand me, and I'm not making light of anything, but if you want to have Pride Month, if you're going to have mass shootings, if you're going to have all kinds of law changes about this and that, and we're going to tell you that morality looks different, and the best definition of morality is for anybody to do whatever they want, and you need to accept it, and you need to applaud for it, and we get so worried and so scared, and you know what? It doesn't even make the light of the gospel flicker. It shines brightly. None of those things take away even the smallest amount of power from who Jesus is and what he is doing. And again, I don't think we should be reckless. I don't think we should be foolish. I also don't think we should be afraid either. Our kids and our culture and the people around us, and the people that we love, yes, we need to pay attention. We also do not need to walk in fear. We also do not have to get angry. We also don't have to wonder what's going to happen or where's everything going to go. Because we know the God that's in charge. You see, they learned the ways of their culture, but they didn't live the lifestyle of their culture. That's a big difference. They learned, they understood, they saw what was going on around them. They were aware of it. They had access to it. As a matter of fact, they were forced to study it. But it didn't change how they lived. It didn't change their faith. Their faith in the hardest moments, when they had lost everything, actually was strengthened. If you think about this, the 3 years of vegetables and water, like I said, that was the worst part. That's the worst part of all of this. From the outside, nothing changed. Nobody in any official or important situation saw anything different for 3 years. But for these guys, every day their faith was being strengthened. Every day they were relying on God. Every day, even though they were exposed to all kinds of junk and stuff, their faith was expanding. And it was thriving, even though they had no privileges. Because their faith was not in a culture. Their faith was not based on what a government was doing. Their faith was not based on what other people said was moral and what other people said wasn't moral. Their faith was based on a God that doesn't change. And a gospel that is not changed. Because unfortunately some ignore it. And Daniel, a little bit of a spoiler alert. He goes on, it says, to serve under the king Cyrus. And some of you, if you know Bible history, you know exactly what that means. But what it means, in essence, is this. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 years, 5 or 6 decades, Daniel served kings and emperors. He started off serving the Babylonian Empire. He retired serving the Persian Empire, Cyrus, because the empire of Babylon fell and the Persian Empire overcame them. But Daniel still stayed in his post because of what God did in his life and how God used him. And some of you, your story is not as dramatic as Daniel. You may feel a lot of the same things that he felt. You may feel like everything has changed. All this stuff's been taken away from me. Things aren't the way they used to be. Things aren't the way I want them to be. I would like it to be different. Whatever your situation is. Not quite as extreme as Daniel. But I know the feeling. I know what it's like to feel like I've lost something. And I look at the world around me and I'm not encouraged. I am discouraged. Here's what I know. As a follower of Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, I don't know what to tell you when it comes to this. But if you are a follower of Jesus, I know this. When what you believe in following him and what you do lines up together, you're unstoppable. Not because you're so great, but because God is so faithful. When we believe and obey, he always, always, always comes through. He always brings about the change we're looking for. And like I said, we may wonder and worry about the world out there. You know, what's going on with this? And we're reading the news, we're checking this, we're checking that. But the reality is, it's the world in here, my world, that most of us are most concerned with. And when what you believe and what you do line up, it's incredible how God comes through in your world over and over and over again. At work, at home, with your finances. And I could tell you stories after story after story, and you could tell each other stories of how God consistently, continually comes through. So how do you live? How do you live determined, but not defiant, in a culture that seemingly is not all that interested in faith? And it really comes down to 2 things, I think. First is you need to know your place. And the second is you need to know how to respond. The knowing your place thing is kind of more up in your head. The respond thing is more in your hands and what you do and how you act. And so let's talk about knowing your place first. See, one of the big things that Daniel makes so apparent is that it is God's story and your place. It is God's story and your place. Now, for Daniel, as I read the book, there were a couple of things. It said that God brought the Babylonians. It said that God gave Daniel favor. It says that God gave Daniel and his friends wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. I mean, it keeps saying over and over and over, God did this, God did this, God did this, God did this. See, this is God's story, and Daniel has a place in it. He absolutely has an important place in God's story. But it's not Daniel's story. It's God's story. And as followers of Jesus, we've talked about this before, and you know this. If I'm a follower of Jesus, my life really isn't my story. My life is God's story. I have a place in it, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I have an important place in God's story. But it's his story, not mine. And so, when my privileges get taken away, when my friends make fun of me, when it feels like the culture is pushing against me, when stuff morally is shoved in my face that I don't want to look at and I don't want to deal with, and I'm told that I should be excited about or accept it or whatever else, I realize this is God's story. I have a place in it, but it's God's story. I can rest in the fact that even though things are not the way I want them to be, he is in control. And here's actually, and this is the hard part to hear, you want to be in those hard spaces. And you know why? Because that's where your faith grows. When you have to go to God in dependence on a daily basis, that's when your faith grows. When you realize that you don't have the strength yourself to overcome what you're facing, that's when your strength grows, because now I have to depend on him, and God's strength shows up in my weakness. And the reason I know it's true is because we're going to see over the next several weeks, even empires bend to God's will. It's his story. I just have a place in it. So I have to keep that perspective. I have to keep that mindset. When I don't like what's going on around me, I got to realize this is God's story. I have a place in it, but it's his story. He's in charge. He's in control, and I can rely on him. So that's kind of the mind space stuff. But what about the hands? What do I do? What is my response? That's what it looks like for determined belief. But what does determined living look like? And it looks like this. It looks like you and I getting comfortable being countercultural. We have to get comfortable being countercultural. When you think about what the world looks like and what it looks like to follow Jesus, they are different. They've always been different. You are countercultural. And as a matter of fact, whether you knew it or not, whether you believed it or not, as soon as you decided to follow Jesus, you became part of a much smaller group of people. And a smaller group of people that's moving in a different direction than most others. I mean, Jesus said it himself. He told us that the gate is wide and open and on a path to destruction, but it's narrow and small for those who find life. So he already told us way from the very beginning, we are not going to be the popular kids, okay? We are going to be countercultural. And it's not because we're wrong, and it's not because Jesus is moving in the wrong direction. It's just because culture is going to have a hard time accepting who he is and what he's about. And so what do we do? What do we do? I think the first thing we do is we have to look at our culture around us. We have to weigh it, and we have to be wise. We have to weigh it and be wise. Jesus did say in Matthew 16, he said that you as a follower, one of his followers, you need to be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. And a lot of people look at that like, what does that mean? What was he saying? I think he's saying this. When it comes to the world around us, we need to pay attention, we need to think deeply, and we need to act lovingly. At a minimum, it means to be likable, right? Like we talked about. I'm going to smile, I'm going to help people, I'm going to encourage people, I'm going to be humble, I'm going to be generous, I'm going to do those things. But here's something, and you know this. You can't change the world. You're not going to change the world. And I hope I'm not popping your balloon. I know your mom told you could. I know all those other things. But you're not going to change the world. But you can change your world. You can absolutely change your world. And you do it by weighing and being wise. And here's where it starts. And I know I'm just going to step on some people's toes, so I apologize ahead. I don't apologize, but I don't want you to be mad at me. How's that? I'm going to step on your toes a little bit. It starts with, how am I responding to culture? Because people usually choose one of two things. They either choose to kind of just go along with everything. I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. I mean, this is what everybody thinks, so this is what I think too, and this is what everybody says is right, so that must be what is right, and I'm just going to go along with it. And I don't think too many people would say that's a great answer. It's not a great answer. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, their response is just the opposite. I'm going to dig in my heels. I'm going to oppose everything. I'm going to complain about everything. I'm going to point out how everybody that believes anything different than me is stupid and wrong and foolish, and I'm just going to dig in my heels. I don't see Jesus doing that. He just doesn't. And here's where it's going to get tight. It ultimately depends on what influence and inputs are coming into your life. What are you streaming? What are you scrolling? What websites are you clicking on? What is entertaining you? What is informing you? And what news broadcast or website or whatever it is that's pouring into you? If those things are pouring more into you than God's word is pouring into you, then you're going to take one of the two really bad answers of go along with everything or oppose everything. If God's word is what's pouring into you, you're going to find that there's a third way. It's not going with everything, and it's not digging in my heels and complaining about everything. There's a third way. Daniel found it, and we've been talking about it all morning. But it starts with me doing an audit. What do I look at for entertainment? If it's all the garbage and junk of culture, is it any wonder that I go along with culture? What do I look at for information? If it's angry, divisive information that's always slanted with an agenda that's pouring into me, guess how I'm going to respond to culture? But if it's God's word and his truth that is pouring into me, guess how I'm going to respond to culture? Like Jesus did. I will choose that third way. And you might say, well, what is that third way? It's to prioritize redemption. It's to prioritize redemption. And that sounds, academic and fancy and cool, but here's what it comes down to. Cultures are never saved. There's no culture that gets saved. And some of you aren't going to like this either. There's no nation that gets saved. It doesn't happen that way. There's no political group that gets saved. It doesn't happen that way. People get saved. When people's hearts change, they change, and their world around them changes. And when that happens often enough, and it happens through the power of Christ and the power of the gospel, when that happens often enough, then things become different. Come on. How long have politicians been arguing with each other? I mean, come on. I mean, how long have people with different views of morality looked and stopped and shouted at each other about what's right and what's wrong? We know how that goes. But when hearts are changed, everything changes. And you might say, well, that's kind of naive. Come on, that's not the way the world works. Jesus lived in a hostile culture. It was so hostile, it crucified him. Okay, it doesn't get much more hostile than that, does it? I mean, and he says in John 17 to his immediate followers and to us, he's very clear. He says, you're in the world, but you're not of it. You're not like that. If you're following me, that's not how it goes. You know that my Father is in control. I love this analogy that I heard. He talks about how the world works, and he was trying to kind of get through this. How do you explain all the stuff that happens and all the things and everything else? And I'll close with this, but I love this analogy. This guy talked about it. He goes, it's like an ocean liner. Our journey through history and God's story is like being on an ocean liner that leaves from New York and is sailing to England. He goes, once all the people are on board, all kinds of stuff happens. Some people make good choices. Some people eat themselves sick. Some people do dumb things. Some people do smart things. But nothing changes that ocean liner and where it's going. It already left. That ship sailed. And it's going to arrive in the port. And there's nothing that anybody on the ship can do to change what's going to happen. You see, God is in control. God sees culture. God knows. God knows when you lose your privileges. God knows when you're asked to sacrifice. God knows when you're in a spot where things are uncomfortable and don't fit and don't work. And you know what? He says, trust me. Follow me. Be for other people. You don't have to live a life that is going along with everybody else or that is opposed to everything else. Be for the people in your world. Prioritize redemption. Live as a representative of me and take on the privilege of being an ambassador of Christ. That's who we are when we follow Jesus. Let's pray together.